Again, a really warm welcome to the College of Engineering at Swansea, and I'm delighted to hand over to a much more attractive person than me, Professor Danaë Stanton Fraser from Bath University, who's our first keynote speaker. Absolutely delighted she's come, and she's been in VR since the 1990s, and I didn't even know VR existed in the 1990s. There we are. So anyway, first speaker, Professor Danaë Stanton Smith from Bath.
Thank you for that introduction. Hi, I'm Danaë. I'm Danaë Stanton Fraser. I'm based at the University of Bath, and I'm from the Department of Psychology, but I'm going to say a little bit more about how my work's really interdisciplinary. I'm delighted to be here today. I had a look at the programme, and there's a fantastic mix of disciplines, and it made me think, right, what do I cover today? Because I've been doing VR work in a number of different areas. So what I've tried to do is give a flavour of some of the things that hopefully fit with some of the talks today as well, ranging from special needs through to sort of more spatial and engineering type work. So yes, as Steve said, I did my PhD in 1994, and I'm a psychologist by background, but decided to use virtual environments as part of my research, using them partly to explore in a research context novel psychology questions, and partly as a tool to aid me doing the research, and I shall show that as I go through. So there's sort of two ways that I've been using VR. So before I start talking about projects, I just thought I'd say a little bit about what we do in Bath more generally. So we have sort of a very broad remit in our lab. So I run a lab called the Create Lab. I've been running this lab for about 14 years in Bath, and we have quite a broad remit. So it's how can we use technology to enhance our lives, improve learning, which I'm going to be talking a bit about today. It could be motivation to learn, so it might not just be learning, it might be motivation, collaboration and communication, and I think you'll see this coming through in some of the projects that I talk about today. And, sorry, wrong button. And while my background is in VR, I've moved to lots of different projects over the years. So I'm going to concentrate mainly on VR today, even though I've done some AR work. But the lab does a very broad range of projects. So we do work on robotics, we do work on identity, we do work on collaboration and communication across all sorts of technologies, mobile technologies. And I'm going to really focus on our work that's in VR during this talk. Keep pressing the wrong button. As Steve hinted, we have a very interdisciplinary approach. So as a psychologist, I started working in VR and realised while I made my own environments at the start, and we were using something called, we didn't have Unity then, so we were using something called Superscape Toolkit. You know, developing those environments and creating themselves and evaluating it as one person doesn't really work. So we started working with teams of computer scientists to develop the environments, and from the psychology and education side, we are doing more of the evaluation of the environments in practice. I think it's really important to work like this. We do quite controlled, and I'm going to show you first some of the more controlled studies that we've done, say lab-based studies using VR. But then a lot of the work that we want to do is actually what we call in the world in human-computer interaction, but what we mean is in the classroom, in the lecture theatre, in a museum, and those places. We don't want to keep it lab-based, so we do some testing in the lab, but a lot of it's around, you know, really going and using the technologies in the place where you want people to be, using them and learning from them. So we do develop some sort of quite controlled questions by asking in context, and then we go back to the lab, so we go backwards and forwards from the lab. And one of the things that we do as well within a lot of our research is we work really closely with the people that we're designing with. So, for example, if we were designing an application for some children in a school, we wouldn't design it and take it in and then get them to use it. We work with them through a process of design where they pilot things, we come back to them, they test it, they feed into the design process. And sometimes that's more just piloting, and sometimes it moves as far as actually being part of the design team. So we'll work in partnerships. I've worked in partnerships with schools over a period of 3 years at a time. I've worked in partnerships with museums over a time. I'm going to mention one of the museum projects today. And I think that's really crucial in the design. We shouldn't design something and then take it as a given product, because if we do, there are going to be things that just like if you design a new house and you start living in it, you realise there are things that you need to change. So we're very much about a participatory design methodology in the lab, and that varies between projects, but it's always one of our philosophies about how we go about designing technologies and how we go about thinking about putting things in context and people really using them. So today's about VR and AR, and I saw that there are a whole range of different topics, but there are also some people talking about virtual reality and some people talking more about augmented reality. I have done work in augmented reality, and I did some work for the BBC a while ago where we were looking at augmenting children's storybooks, and we did a large-scale evaluation for them. But most of my work's been in VR, so I'm going to focus on VR for the sake of just keeping it quite focused for this morning. But happy if we have any questions to talk about AR as well within the questions. So there was this big VR promise. When I started my PhD, it was called the sort of second wave of VR. Now, in hindsight, people are calling it the second wave of VR. But in the 1990s, there was this massive promise of VR. So the military were using it. It was being used in healthcare in some ways. It was still expensive. It's still difficult to build the environments. But there was this big promise of VR was going to move into education. And it was going to be the next big thing. And everyone was going to be using VR for all sorts of applications within education. And at the point I started my PhD, as you do a big literature review, and there were a whole number of different universities working in VR, looking at different aspects of education. And a lot of that research still holds today, and I'm going to sort of mention some of it. But what happened, like many things in education, it was a bit behind the curve, actually, in terms of the technology. And while there were a lot of research findings, they didn't feed into practice in classrooms or in lecture theatres. So there was a lot of research at that time, but not so much practical use of it. Now we're into a third wave of VR, and over the last few years, due to, as you all know, things like the Oculus, being able to program in Unity, it becoming a lot more available to households, to schools, and the price coming down, has suddenly meant we've got this new wave of VR and this new promise for education and other areas as well. There's lots of research that we can take that's already been done, and there's lots of research going on now with this new wave, thinking about education and learning. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the projects we've done in a number of areas. But I think there's also an awful lot of challenges, which are exciting because those are the things we want, research challenges and challenges to think about and how we use this technology and how it's integrated into the curriculum. And I think it's really exciting what's happening at Swansea. So when Steve said, did we learn anything? We did, because I haven't seen a university that is integrating across the curriculum. So lots of people are doing projects, lots of people are doing research projects on VR. So, UCL has a load, Nottingham, there's a lot of places I collaborate with who are doing projects around public speaking or embodiment, but actually integrating it within the teaching curriculum, I haven't seen it across the board. I've seen it just in one particular lecture series. So I think it's a really ambitious but quite exciting thing to think about. And of course, this is a great stage to be doing that because the technology is coming down in price. There's Google Cardboard. There are other things that you can do in order to enhance the interaction across multiple students. But of course, there are masses of challenges as well in terms of how isolating VR can be, ethics around using VR. And those challenges are part of them. For me, they're all research questions. And this is there's so many questions ready for people to explore, lots of PhD possibilities in terms of evaluating how these technologies fit into different curriculum types. And I know people are going to be talking about that today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what people are doing in all different areas. So I'm just going to briefly say a little bit about the education context. So I've done a lot of work in schools, and obviously I'm universities as well. And I've sat on a number of bodies. One of them was the Technology for Education. There was a strategic advisory group for BECTA, they were called at the time. They're now part of the Department for Education. And this was a few years ago, and they were, DFE are great to work with. In fact, I've done a secondment there fairly recently. But one thing that became really clear to me joining that group was how far schools were behind in their use of technology. I mean, way behind the population. So, children using all sorts of different technologies, and schools at that point in time, so this is a few years ago, they were talking about how successful the government initiative had been on whiteboards. And I'd gone in, they'd invited me, because I was doing a lot of work on mobile interaction at that point, and they'd asked me to come to talk about how you could integrate mobiles into the curriculum, and that's another big question, and there's a whole story around that. But, they were nowhere near thinking about VR. VR didn't come into that at that point. And that's due to a number of barriers, resources. But the curriculum, thinking across the curriculum, which is one of the exciting challenges we've got here, that people are going to be thinking about different curriculum areas, and what you integrate in one curriculum area might not work for another one. Infrastructure, and setting up that infrastructure. So I think Swansea are trying really hard to set up an infrastructure of people who can support other people, which is great because that's what you need in order to do this. And the expertise for teachers, lecturers. It's a big undertaking, and it needs to have some payoff. They need to know their students are benefiting, whether it's increased motivation, hopefully increased learning. What is it that the students are gaining? So that's a lot of background, but I didn't have in a small talk, but I could have done a whole literature review, and I got quite excited about coming here because there isn't a forum like this. There are lots of different conferences. So for years I went to the Virtual Reality and Disability Conference that's been running for a long time. There was a storytelling in VR. There's the big VR techie conferences, but not a really forum for education. So I think it's a really nice context. So I'm going to dive now into some projects. I'm afraid it'll be a bit of a whirlwind. I'm not going to be able to go into much depth in any of the projects, but I'm really happy to answer questions afterwards or during the talk, and also to talk to people at the breaks about them. But I'm just going to go through a few projects. So I should have said what areas. Sorry, I'm going to concentrate on spatial skills, because that was one of the big areas of work that I looked at. So developing spatial skills through using virtual environments. I'm going to talk about a little bit, very briefly, about history and storytelling, a little bit about ecology, and very briefly about a project we're doing at the moment on pro-social behaviour. So I'm not going to do all the psychology behind it, but just so everybody has a brief idea of what I'm talking about when I say I'm going to use the term cognitive map. It's a psychological term, and it basically means as you explore your environment, you develop a map of your environment in your head, and how this looks. People debate, is it an actual map-like structure? Is it a hierarchical structure? Is it list-like? There's loads and loads of debate about what this cognitive map looks like in your head, and obviously neuroscientists are looking at what happens in particular parts of the brain. But what I was interested in was whether you could develop people's cognitive maps using virtual environments. So people develop a cognitive map through exploring the physical environment, or they had done in the past, and for me, what was particularly interesting was that you might be able to use this to aid people who really struggled forming a cognitive map. And that could be people who weren't very good at exploring and were able-bodied. But more importantly, I thought I've been working with some children with special needs, and they were limited by their wheelchairs because their carers were, very good, they were pushing them around, but they obviously took shortest routes and things like that. So they didn't get the exploration of their environment that other people got. And I was thinking, is this a way that we could use VR in order to enhance cognitive maps? And just, in the same way, adults and children, their cognitive maps grow with the familiarity to the environment, exposure to landmarks, self-initiated exploration, and that's quite important, the fact that you're exploring the environment yourself. And children with restricted mobility, lots of research has shown that they have much worse spatial skills and cognitive maps. So, no laughing at the environments. So these environments were some that, not the middle one and the shopping centre one, were a couple from my PhD. I'm going to just talk about some of the studies that led on. So I did my PhD in this area around spatial skills, and I carried on, BT funded it for 10 years following that. So we did a whole load of studies that I haven't got time to talk about today, but I should just hint at a few of them just to give you a flavour. And why did we use virtual environments? Well, as we all know, they're spatially, you can move through them in real time, similar freedom to real world exploration. Obviously, there's lots of caveats to that. But I developed really simplistic environments, and you can see in a minute, I'll show a couple of them, but I'm in the one in the middle I'm going to talk about in a minute. It was a tool for a psychology experiment. The one on the right, at that time, was quite a realistic shopping centre. It's not now, but that was developed in Superscape Toolkit. And the idea was that you could use, and I was carrying, at this point in time, and this is true, I would be carrying, we didn't have laptops, so I'd be carrying my desktop computer down to the car to go to the school, and I would go to the school with this desktop computer, and I'd be displaying, because you couldn't have headsets at that time because they were so heavy. I used to spend a bit of time on them, but it wouldn't be ethical to give them to the children. So it'd be a desktop environment with a 3D environment that I created to scale on the computer. So you can imagine how difficult that was to do things, what we call in the world, because you just didn't have the capacity, you didn't have the technology in order to do it. We managed, but it was hard to test lots and lots of participants. So I'm just going to very briefly sort of just give you the results of one study and mention the other areas that we looked at. So in order to navigate your environment, a really good test of whether you've developed a spatial map is whether you can take shortcuts. There are other tests as well, but it's one really good test. And so I'd looked at some animal behaviour studies where I'd worked with somebody in Marseille who had developed a maze, and they actually use it with hamsters to look at their spatial skills. And I redeveloped it for use with humans in a virtual environment. So I knew this paradigm worked. I tested it with adults, children, elderly people, and children with disabilities. So I tested it with all types of people. And basically what I was looking at was using it as a tool to test spatial maps, to see if people could take shortcuts. So children explored this simulated maze, and I've got, look how simplistic it is. Obviously, you were in a first-person viewpoint, so you were standing within that maze. You weren't looking above. But it was incredibly simplistic. And I had these barriers, and you'd explore a couple of routes, and then you'd explore 2 more routes, and each time from one room, and then some would be marked off, and then you'd be asked to take the shortcut that you'd never taken before. And what we found was that children who were more mobile when they were young, so there were children who'd been in a wheelchair practically since they were born, but we also had a group who were more mobile when they were young, but as they got older, they'd moved into a wheelchair. We could distinguish between their spatial maps through using these shortcut studies. So this was a tool, a VR tool, enabling us to do psychology research that was really hard to do in the real world. And we carried on this theme of work, and as I said, we worked on this for about 13 years altogether, and we did a whole number of studies. So obviously then what was exciting was, can we use VR in order to train these spatial skills? So if we see these spatial skills are missing, can we actually train them within virtual environments? And I did a whole number of studies looking at transfer from different virtual environments. So children would learn in a virtual environment, they'd be taken to a different virtual environment, could they increase their skills? And then the acid test is, can you move that to the real environment? So I did studies where I developed There was a school in Leicester, and I recreated it to scale. And I took a group of children who had never been to that school. They explored the virtual environment of that school over a period of time. They did a number of tests where they were pointing to things in different rooms, where they were navigating around. And then I took them on a trip to the real school and tested their spatial skills. They could find their way round, they could point to objects they couldn't see from their viewpoints. It's like me saying, now, can you point to the entrance of the campus? You know, they're not easy tasks. And they could navigate through. So we found really, really great training effects of using VR on spatial skills. We carried on to look at things like active and passive processing. So one of the things that we found a lot in VR, and we've tested and written about, is being active in the process. If you're passive in the process, so if you're in the VR but somebody else is moving you around, you don't develop the same spatial skills as if you're active in that process in VR. And so all of this, you know, we got really excited about all this. We moved some of the tasks to mobile technologies as well. But there are things that we don't get. So, for example, it's exciting, the transfer of training. I think there are loads and loads of different areas now that use this in terms of developing spatial skills through virtual environments. However, it doesn't transfer. If you see that on that mobile device, that's called a Shepherd and Cooper test. It's a test of spatial rotation, and you've probably seen it because they're in all sorts of intelligence tests. But it doesn't transfer to that. They're very specific spatial skills that you're learning in these types of environments. So I'm going to stop about spatial skills now, but obviously I'm really happy to answer questions about them because we've done a large amount of studies on spatial skills. But I think the transfer of training is really important, the fact you can transfer those skills. So I did that whole theme of work, and then I'd been at a number of different universities, and I then moved to Nottingham, which is a fantastic place to work. It's the mixed reality lab, and I worked in a psychology department, and then I worked in the computer science department. So at that point, I became really interdisciplinary. And we did a whole number of projects that we would call mixed reality projects, so including virtual reality, but they'd also have other dimensions to them, a lot of augmented reality work. But I'm just going to focus a little bit on one today, and that was around history. We had an EU project, and we were looking at whether we could teach history through virtual environments. So we included a load of schools, but we also worked in the museum. So it's a Nottingham museum, and anyone who's been to Nottingham Castle, it doesn't look anything like the original one. So you just see parts of it, but it doesn't look anything like what it used to look. And we wanted to engage with visitors, but we also wanted to engage with schools. So we developed this project, working with the schools beforehand to create some environments to enable children to learn the history of the museum. And there was a lot more to it than that, but I'll keep it quite brief. So what they did was that visitors or children, we had groups of children coming in from schools, and we were doing sort of particular testing, but we also had lots of visitors taking part. And we were doing, this was in the wild, so it was a completely different type of study. It was a qualitative study. The sort of data we were collecting was very different. And we got people to wander around the museum, and they could draw pictures, or they could take rubbings of things. And the paper was electronically tagged so that when they came back to what we had as the story tent, they could see the virtual environment of the time period of that picture. So that's at the top of both pictures of the tent, and you wouldn't believe how many people got into this tent. We were really surprised. You know, there were really elderly people getting in there, and we were like, oh no, because we hadn't thought about that from a health and safety. But people really drawn to this quite little immersive experience, you know, where you sat in the tent, you took your picture, you put it on, and immediately that time period, and we had a number of time periods, I think it was 6 or 7 time periods, came up, and it was audio as well, so it's spatial audio, and you had little touches for the children, like invisible writing that you saw as it came up. But, you know, it was designed as a sort of experience. I think what was really interesting about this was how easy you can make something immersive, and actually how nice the environment was for visitors as well as for children. But we did an evaluation of collaboration here. And one of the things that's interesting is because lots of VR experiences are singular, they're isolated, whereas this experience was really collaborative. And actually what we saw, because we analysed the talk and interaction within the tent, in quite a lot of detail, we coded all the lots of people who came into the tent, their talk. And we found that actually it was the people building on each other's ideas and discussing it was a really, really important bit around the learning in this, which obviously gives you food for thought about how you design virtual environments when you're designing them for learning and you want people to collaborate. But for example, if you've got the Oculus, it's great, but it's a very singular experience. We also had a thing, I haven't brought it here, I haven't talked about it here, but we also had a thing that looked really clunky now, but it looked like, I don't know if you've seen the social robots that are just literally like a laptop on a stick and they move around. It was called an augoscope, and as you moved around the castle, you held it, and you could see that it was mapped, the whole castle was mapped, so you could see the virtual environment at another time period as you moved through. So we had a number of different technologies going on at the same time. So I'm sorry, I'm being speedy because I'm conscious of time. I've got a few projects to get through. So another project that we did sort of at the end of the time I was at Nottingham was called Savannah. And this was looking more at, there was a group of schools in Bristol and they really wanted to teach their children, it was part of the curricula, about lion pride. So it was part of their curriculum and they were thinking of different ways of doing it. And we thought, right, we'll come in, we'll see if we can do something in VR. And so we spent a long time, as I said, in this sort of participatory design process. We worked with the schools, we worked with the teachers. We had a BBC Natural History, somebody from the BBC Natural History unit who was an expert in lion prides and had lived with lion prides, and she was amazing actually, who advised us on all the content for the project. And what we did was we mapped over one of the Bristol schools' playing fields, we mapped a virtual savannah. And so as you moved round with your mobile device, you sort of got an image on your mobile that you were walking through particular parts, you got bits about the lions. It was audio enabled as well. So, and then what we did was got groups of schools coming in and we redesigned, so we did a pilot with one set of schools and then the BBC person was helping us. It was a really iterative process. And then we did a large-scale evaluation of that. And again, it was a more qualitative evaluation because the numbers didn't really make sense in this. We really sort of try and think what sort of evaluation we're going to do when we're looking at these types of technologies. And we could have done a lot more around that. We only had a particular amount of funding for that, and it was really disappointing because we could have actually taken that a lot further, I think, that project. A bit more recently, so since I've been at Bath, I've done quite a lot of work on robotics, which I'm not going to talk about today. But we've also had this stream of work with the BBC that's gone on for a whole number of years. And we've had a number of partnerships with them as well. And one of the projects that's just finished recently, that's why I haven't got a reference up for it yet, it's one of my PhD students who's just completed. She's been based at the BBC during her PhD. And she's been doing work on second screens. But the particular thing she's been working on is how to make your room immersive. So it's called augmented wallpaper or smart wallpaper. And so, for example, if you imagine a children's room, and rather than just having a little projection, 3 walls are projected and they can change what that is. That could be a savannah. It could be a concert. It could be... And they've been working on this concept at the BBC. And one of my students went and worked for 4 years looking at if you use multiple devices in that, so they're already developing that, and she was looking at if you then integrate, your iPad and other, how that works and where you could learn things from doing this, and what was important in terms of your mental workload, what she did eye tracking studies to see where people were looking. It was a really, really exciting project, and there's an awful lot of work going on in that at the BBC at the moment. Unfortunately, in the second year of her PhD, she was so good, they offered her 3 jobs. She took one of the jobs, so she was then doing it part-time. And the minute she got her PhD, she was promoted to head of one of the sections. So it was great in terms of her career. It was a bit like, oh no, because it was a brilliant piece of research, really, really exciting. And then, just briefly, because I'm conscious of time, this is our current project. We've got a big EPSRC project called Virtual Realities. It's not so much about education, but there are some aspects to it that I think are really exciting in terms of today's talks. It's looking at immersive documentary experiences. So it's looking at non-fiction, and we're working with documentary makers, and we're working with VR companies at the BBC again. And I'm just going to very briefly tell you about a couple of things that I think relate today. Well, I think some of our research questions are really pertinent to some of the things we'll be talking about today. So immersion, we're looking at immersion. How does that, if you're immersed, and that could be, and we're looking at different levels of immersion, everything from desktop through to Oculus, having limited views in the Oculus, all sorts of different configurations. Do we gain more or less and retain more or less knowledge of the environment that we've been in? Spatiality, I've done a lot of work, I haven't mentioned that, but I've done a lot of work. I worked for the Ministry of Defence for a while doing VR for future cockpits, so I designed virtual environments of aircraft displays. And we looked at different viewpoints, so whether you sit within the plane or whether you have a tethered viewpoint, you know, like in a games machine where you're looking down on the plane. And all of these, there's very interesting different things that you get from these different viewpoints. And that's similar in the way of documentary. You might, if you're the first person in the documentary, or if you're sitting above it in a allocentric way. Embodiment, what does embodiment offer? What does this standing in others' shoes that people use, what does that mean? What does that mean for how you experience the environment? Affect, emotion, so is it more engaging in 2D versus 3D? What kinds of emotions are prompted by VR experience? Some of these things we're looking at are quite emotional things there. You know, children in refugee camps, and there's this whole thing around the empathy machine. Is VR the empathy machine? And we're sort of looking at some questions around that. And then agency, and then a lot of the work I've done, it's been quite interactive actually in the virtual environments. But a lot of the 360 videos we're seeing are more about just observing and looking, and and what does that mean for the experience you get? So those are some of the questions that we're grappling with at the moment, and there are many more. But just to sort of, we've been talking about these for the last year, and they're things that have come up. They're things that we thought about during my PhD, but in a very different way. And we've got a whole number of studies, and I can't go into them in any detail because of time, but currently we're running an audience, a household study, where we're getting 15 families to experience VR over a period of time, so about 8 weeks, and doing an ethnographic study of their use of VR. We're doing some psychology lab-based studies, and I'm just going to mention one very briefly in a second. We're commissioning 3 VR pieces, and we're trying to feed our research into those pieces. So we've got money to commission VR documentaries, and then we're seeing if we can, for example, it might be around the viewpoint in the environment, we're seeing if we can feed our research in. And one of the exciting things that a couple of members of our project, Chris and Dave, have developed is a mediography. And they've found that people find it really hard to find the content that they want for VR. And there are loads and loads in this particular area. There are lots and lots of non-fiction pieces out there, but people are sort of searching for them, and it's actually very difficult to find them. So they've developed something called a mediography, and there's a link to it there. You could take a look if you wanted, with a whole number of pieces so that it's organised and you can find it. We might be able to do that in other areas. I think it's a really interesting approach. And I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to finish here. So the studies that we're running at this point in time are looking at social bias. So we're seeing if we can, if immersion in particular environments and particular content could change social bias. We haven't got the results yet, so I can't tell you for this particular one, but there have been some studies that we're following up on in this area. We're looking at recall. So we're looking at, what you recall from these particular environments. We're doing a number of experimental studies looking at that. And we're also looking at pro-social behaviour. So we're looking at things like, will people donate to particular charities or more engaged in particular things if they've had a lot of experience. We don't know that they definitely will, but we're exploring that as one of our hypotheses. I think I've been talking for about 35 minutes, so I'll stop there in case there are any questions. So I hope I haven't oomed you. I get really excited about this. But yeah, really happy to answer questions. Thanks very much. Hello.
Is there, what is it been invented by the media? Is there a background between VR and AR in the same way as Betamax and VHS? Or are they so closely related that it shouldn't really be different?
I wouldn't say so. I mean, I'm only talking from my own perspective. And in terms of the technology, companies, I couldn't really tell you. But in terms of the research, definitely, no, people, well, I mean, I would say throughout, in the different places and the different groups I work with, they're used interchangeably, dependent, a bit like your methodology. You choose the right technology for the particular context you're in. So sometimes, that's when I was saying I've concentrated on VR here, but sometimes like an AR project would be more appropriate, an augmented reality view for that particular piece of work you're doing, that particular piece of learning. So for the children with the schools, it was about books, and you wouldn't want to display that on a separate thing. You need it to be overlaid on the book, So it's the context, I think.
Hello.
Hello.
I would like to ask you. You mentioned that active users in VR, so not passive, are actually more engaged. I'm from a startup focusing on VR in education. We have an experience where people can come to us and in a castle and experience this VR game that we created.
Yeah.
One issue that we found with active, so we use HTC Vive, so
Yeah.
people can interact with objects.
Yeah.
It's actually that the experience itself is so overwhelming because there are so many things that people don't remember at all.
Yeah.
What we actually try to teach them. So the
Yeah.
recall rate is really low. So I would like to know your take on that.
Yes, in fact, I've found really similar things. We've done a recent study where we were looking at recall after people they were just using Google Cardboard. We had a load of people using Google Cardboard, and we were looking at recall, and we found even in Google Cardboard, which we thought would be, the first few minutes of the data is just absolutely no good because they can't remember the first things they watch because they're so excited about the technology. But I mean, most of our projects we would... So you're doing are they one-off experiences? Because normally we would have, particularly in any of the studies, we would have a sort of build-in where people would experience some environments before they went into the one you wanted them to learn from so that the novelty effect to some extent, it won't have completely gone.
Yeah, we do that. We have basically 3 scenes.
Yeah.
The first one is just like a completely empty space where they can take objects.
Yeah. And I think the complexity of the environment makes a difference. And if you've got I've seen this a lot with when you're looking at haptic feedback, if the interaction's really fluid, I mean, when I'm talking about active and passive processing, I'm talking about, in this particular context I was talking, it's about somebody navigating an environment. And so it's very much about the spatial map. But I can see what you're saying. I don't know what the task is, but when you've got quite a complex task, and I've seen this a lot with haptics, where it's quite difficult to pick up an object in the virtual environment, for example. It's not as fluid as in the real environment. You feel people start concentrating on that and not on the thing that they're meant to be learning. So what is your task?
We basically allow them to be an archer with the customer.
Oh, okay. That's
So they
yeah.
take a bow and
Yeah.
they learn information. Then I can share a video.
Yeah.
They learn about the bow and the
Yeah.
defense of the castle. So
Yeah.
it's a bit complex.
Yeah.
It's not really straightforward.
So you think it's them being part of the interaction that's actually they're not learning as well?
Yes.
Yeah.
I also think that we use a lot of words and
Yeah.
there is a voice that tells about information. I don't think that is the most effective way to convey information.
Yeah, so some people are looking... So in some of the documentaries that we're looking at, there's quite a lot of audio. And in the study, one of the studies we've done recently, we found that's a bit distracting in terms... Because people are trying to... they're in an Oculus, so they're looking around, so you don't know what they're looking at, so they might not recall things if they haven't happened to turn in a certain direction. And they've got the audio going on at the same time that actually can be quite distracting. We're trying to work that out at the moment, how we should do that for our recall experiment. So it sounds like we're coming up with some similar issues, actually.
Thanks.
Hello.
Following on directly from that gentleman's point, one of my experiences is that students have to learn how to use the technology, the VR technology itself, before they can start doing the learning within the VR. So quite a lot of the sessions that I run, you spend a lot of time just introducing the technology, and then you lose that period and do active learning within it. So I'm just interested, how do you scaffold your experiments to avoid that?
Yeah, so and it is difficult. It's the same. So for experimental studies, it's a bit different because we'll have a process we go through and we sort of think, what's the novelty factor? But when we're trying to implement something, say, in the classroom, and this could be any form of technology, I've done a lot of work, like I was saying, with classes over time, it has been a process of engaging them in the design in order, but you can only do this if you've got a long time and you're not restricted to a particular, I've got to get this done in this one class. We've spent a lot of time out of school doing things with the teachers, after school clubs where people trial things, and this isn't just VR, this is mobile technologies, this is, integrating mobile technologies in the classroom is actually really difficult for teachers as well. So yeah, this is, I think it's a really big issue into how, if you don't want to spend half your class setting up the technology and people getting used to it, and actually then you move on, and we've had absolutely this dilemma with loads and loads of our projects. And it normally ends up, and the difficult thing is, in our case, it's often working with schools rather than university students in our research, but an enthusiastic teacher makes such a massive difference to our projects, because an enthusiastic teacher will engage with you out of the time, but still the setup often needs, us there too. And we spent a lot of time, we had a project called Participate, where we spent a lot of time working through that process. How would the teacher be able to take this on their own? But it is a process. You can't just walk into the classroom and do it. I don't know, with the university students, do you do things outside of, is it in lectures that you're doing?
It's further education and higher education.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
A mixture, so within lectures or within...
It's really hard to evaluate that as well if you've just got one-off sessions where you really want to show something, but the novelty factor is really difficult. I think it's only when you use it over time that you can really evaluate it really effectively.
You can gauge engagement.
Yes, engagement and motivation.
Attainment,
yeah.
There's no way of really knowing.
No, and lots of people do measure motivation. They use in psychology, they use motivation scales and things like that. And lots of people find enhanced motivation, but find it really hard to say whether learning's actually taken place or not. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yes. Oh, you choose this. Oh, you've got to say. Shall I think your hand was up first, so shall I ask?
I don't mind with a psychology question, really.
Yeah, that's okay.
So as a psychologist, I'm obsessed with ethics.
Oh, yeah.
But very, very new to VR. I'm just wondering, in your experience, daily experience, do you have any way of, in any sense, of predicting how individuals are going to react to VR? And I don't mean the tasks. I mean, we
psychological
incorporated consent and screening tools,
yeah.
and we're finding it's relatively unpredictable.
It is, and we, a major part of all the projects is thinking about the ethics for us. As a psychologist, it's ingrained into you as well, isn't it? That we're actually running an ethics workshop quite soon on the VR project for just that reason. And in my own work, you've got the sort of classic things like the Oculus. You're not yet meant to use with an under 13-year-old. We wanted to include children in our household studies. That's actually from American legislation. But actually, is it ethical to put young children in a headset? Actually, UCL have been doing work with 3 to 5-year-olds in a headset. But if somebody's got, it's difficult when we're screening for studies actually, because we want to have the general population take part. But actually, if somebody's got severe anxiety or things like that, we're really careful about who goes into those environments, because you just don't know what it might provoke, particularly if you're looking at something that you're thinking is going to be more realistic and actually might change your behaviour some way. So it's really tricky, and for every single project, we have to go through a full ethics committee for everything we do. But for every single project, that's one of the major things that we agonise over and think through. And I think it's different for everything we're doing because they're completely different projects. What are you looking at?
Well, it's also, we haven't done any studies yet, it's more within the educational aspect, but in terms of, because we're very new, looking at screening tools and checklists and things like epilepsy, vertigo, and all those things warning off. And what we're actually finding is that you can do that, but with members of staff that have used it and we've given them a screening tool, one of them, for example, ticked everything.
Yeah.
And we just said, okay, it's not advisable for you to do this.
Yeah.
And he said, I'm a psychologist, before consent, I'm going to make a decision to actually do it.
Yeah.
But I don't hold you responsible.
Yeah.
He did it, had the most amazing experience, and didn't stop talking about it for days.
Yeah.
And didn't have any adverse effects.
Yeah.
But typically in psychology, we would have said, actually, we don't want you to do this.
And it's very tricky working in an interdisciplinary team, which we do all the time, because we'll always be the stricter ones in terms of ethics. And some of our computer science colleagues, for example, across the country, I won't name particular ones, but they don't even have an ethics committee. They have an ethics officer who will say yes or no, and they have a very different outlook on, you know, and in some ways they're saying it should get out to everybody. Why are we restricting it to this group of people? But and we are always sort of negotiating that as we're working through, not just the actual ethics, but the working between the disciplines as well, and working at. But I think it's for each particular project, so we consider it based on what they're going to be experiencing in each project. But ethics is a really big topic, and as I said, we've just actually decided to run a workshop as part of our virtual reality project just on the ethics of using VR in this area. So we'll have to invite you.